Right, hello everyone. This is Practical Criticism Week 6 lecture for the class on Northanger Abbey. Excuse me. For this class, there's a bit of a lecture component, but for the most part, we'll be talking through extracts of text from the novel itself to imitate what the classroom activity would have involved. So that'll be the lion's share of the recording. To begin with, however, we do have a lecture, so I'll get started with that. So a bit of background. Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen, completed in 1803. One of Austen's earlier works, not quite juvenilia, but slightly later, and was published posthumously in 1817, along with Persuasion. They were published as two parts of one book. Northanger Abbey was the first half, Persuasion was the second half. And it ties into the sort of thing Austen was fond of writing early on, which is this kind of parody novel. Sense and Sensibility is another example of this. It's a parody, but of sentimental fiction. So that's that sort of 18th century over-the-top sentimental stuff like Oliver Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield, Henry Mackenzie's Man of Feeling. She sort of sensed a target there with these ridiculous, over-the-top plots with people wandering the streets and seeing orphans and crying and making a big show of how much they weep every day, being dehydrated because they have no tears left in them, this kind of thing. So she sensed a target there and wrote Sense and Sensibility as a sort of soft parody of it. And this kind of work is symptomatic of early Austen. As I say, particularly in the transitional state between that juvenilia and our later work, which became more serious, more realist. Northanger Abbey sits somewhere in the middle there. You have the very prominent parodic elements, specifically with reference to Gothic, but you also have the signs of what's to come with the incidents and adventures that Catherine gets into at Bath. This foreshadows her later work. So the novel's best understood in the context of 1790s fiction. It was published later in the 19th century, of course, but as I said, it was originally completed in 1803, so the sensibilities and concerns of the 1790s are very much at the fore of it. Fiction in this time was read primarily by women, and male reviewers, male academics, male historians frequently discussed it in condescending terms. They looked down on it. They saw it as a kind of lesser form of literature, a lesser occupation, something for women, something not for men. And these are all themes that the novel itself explores. So it's not just a fictional novel to be read for fun, it's addressing concerns, it's considering cultural issues. Before we get into talking about the themes, I wanted to talk about the narrative style. This is quite a self-aware novel. It's a novel that foregrounds the process of writing and makes the novel itself a sort of theme within itself. So the way in which the narrative is being told is itself quite an important thing to consider. It's something called free indirect discourse, a technique whereby a third-person narrator speaks of the character as he or she and gives the character's own thoughts in the character's voice. The narrator thereby gives us an insight into Catherine's thoughts, despite being one step removed, despite being in the kind of position of the omniscient narrator. They still have that intimate involvement with the character themselves. The qualities of the character can alter the tone and the content of the narrator's own words. This is like the character is being channeled or perhaps possessed. So the omniscient third-person narrator will talk as if they sound like Catherine or whichever character is being described. There's a sort of bleeding over from one to the other. Often there's an ambiguity as to where one begins and the other ends. A good novelist such as Austen is will play with this ambiguity. And in this novel we see this sort of thing. The term free indirect discourse wasn't, of course, made into a term, and it wasn't formalised until much later. Austen is doing it almost instinctively because, well, she was one of the originators of the way of doing it. It was only later, as I say, that it became a kind of form that you could imitate. The narrator signposts the moments when she shifts from speaking in her own voice to ventriloquising Catherine's thoughts in this style of free and direct discourse. Here we have a sort of transitional remark that signposts when this is happening. Something like, "it seemed to Catherine." But often, fairly often, she switches from her own voice to Catherine's voice without signposting that alteration. So that's when you end up with this ambiguity that I mentioned. The narrative doesn't much enter the minds of other characters, so for the most part we have that third-person perspective, but merged with the first-person novelistic style of following one character, then being our route through the story. So that's enough about the narrative for now. It's certainly something that we'll return to. As I said, the narration and the act of narrating, the act of writing a novel or of reading a novel, is one of the foremost themes of this entire book. So it's certainly something that we will come back to in the course of discussing and analysing parts of the text. One of the other foremost themes, I mentioned Austen's early habit of making parodies of other types of novels. This is a parody of the Gothic, but it also has something feeding into it called the quixotic or the quixotic. This is an inheritance from Don Quixote, the famous Spanish novel, one of the founding works indeed of all Western literature, not just novels. You probably all have encountered Don Quixote in some capacity or another before, but the meat of it is that the main character, the Don of the title, he reads too many chivalric romances, these stories of the Middle Ages, of chivalric knights and princesses being rescued from towers, things like that. And he's inspired, as a result of it, to become a knight-errant. So he alters his life to match his expectations that he's picked up from reading fiction. His brain has gone wrong because he's read too many novels, basically. And as a consequence, he fails to see the world for what it really is. Instead, he imagines everything in terms of knightly romances, this material he's fed himself on. The famous phrase, tilting at windmills, comes from this novel. This is because Don Quixote is so delusional with his novel view of the world that he sees windmills as giants and he charges at them. He tilts them with his lance and attacks them because he thinks that the novel or the fictional overlay of reality is more real than the real reality. So very, very influential. But there is, even at the beginning of the Quixotic, this underpinning sense of perhaps he's not quite that wrong, perhaps he's more commendable. The sort of chivalric innocence and virtue of Don Quixote is itself often portrayed as being better in many ways, more moral, more consistent than the cynical world that sees him as insane. So that sort of subversive tendency is there from the beginning, and it's certainly something, as we shall see, that is present in Northanger Abbey as well. But Austen channeled Don Quixote through another famous work. That's the female Quixote, also known as The Adventures of Arabella, by Charlotte Lennox. This is a novel from 1752, so within recent memory, within living memory, I should say, of when Austen was originally writing in the first decade of the 19th century. She very much used it as a model for Northanger Abbey. I think a lot of critics tend to have a consensus on this. And the plotline follows that Arabella, our main character, reads too many French romance novels, and as a consequence, because she's very sheltered, she thinks that these are true accounts of what's actually happened in history. She expects that her life will match these expectations, and hilarity ensues. There's a couple of suitors who are trying to woo her into marriage, one of whom, Grenville, is very earnest and very honest, and he's constantly getting mixed up, whereas the other more cynical suitor plays into her expectations and starts acting as if he too is in a novel to try and win her over that way. The end of the novel comes when Arabella throws herself into a river. She sees some innocent horsemen as ravishers coming to take her away, much as happens in these French romance novels. So she chucks herself in the river and gets soaked through and gets a chill, gets ill on account of it. So she's lying in a bed, and at the very end of the novel, a kindly doctor explains to Arabella the difference between literature and reality and corrects her and essentially she is cured. She can go back into her life without the delusion and be a productive member of society, if you like. She's released, fully cured. So, in exploring the quixotic, Austen is sort of tying into this tendency. Don Quixote is parodying chivalric literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Charlotte Lennox is parodying the French romances that were popular in the 18th century. And Jane Austen sort of reached around into what was popular at the end of the 18th century, which was this Gothic novel stuff. Novelists such as Anne Radcliffe, who was the most popular writer of her day, almost universally admired, the Mighty Enchantress, the Shakespeare of romance writers she was called, The Mysteries of Udolpho was her big breakthrough classic, which is referenced by name several times in Northanger Abbey. You had others, Horace Walpole, Matthew Lewis, what's called the Northanger Horrids, because they're mentioned in the novel, Castle of Wuthenbach, Claremont, etc. These novels were lost. People thought they were Austen's invention, that they were just made-up names that sounded ridiculous for a long time, until 20th century scholarship proved that they did actually exist, which shows how many of these things were produced because they were so in vogue, because they were so profitable. So this is what was popular during Austen's time. So it makes sense that this would be the raw material that goes into her parody and that goes into her sort of specific iteration of the quixotic mode. The character here, the kind of Arabella equivalent, Charlotte, Catherine, reads too many Gothic novels, and her view of the world is altered as a result. What's new as well in Austen is irony, a lot of irony, in fact. We have the quixotic as Austen's starting point, but she doesn't do a sort of straightforward repeat of the quixotic idea. She doesn't just do a rerun of the female Quixote with the Gothic now as the source of the comedy. She does something different, as you'll probably notice when you've read the novel. Can we really say that Catherine ends up being cured of her condition, like Arabella? Or is it even a condition in the first place? I would say there's a subtle level underneath the overt irony and the overt joke that she's constantly making mistakes because she's read too much, that ultimately seems to vindicate Catherine in a way, that ultimately seems to point towards her being right. Perhaps like the original Don Quixote, who has more of our sympathy and more of our respect because he belongs to a sort of lost tradition of nobility and honour. Catherine herself seems to have a similar thing going on. She doesn't belong to the age, the sort of cynical age that she's in, reflected by her friends at Bath, people like John Thorpe, who seem to represent more the age. She has a sort of naive simplicity, which is itself commendable, and which, as I said, is ultimately vindicated. We'll explore this in more depth as the lecture goes on. This is the main thrust of our textual analysis. But the general tendency is towards a vindication of novel reading. The quixotic novel tends to be, the joke tends to be at the expense of the person who's making the mistakes, who's misjudging reality, who's seeing things as what they aren't. But in vindicating Catherine, the novel form itself becomes vindicated, and the value of reading them. It's not something that will lead you astray like all those 18th and early 19th century literary critics and academics were saying. It's not something that will mislead you and waste your time. There is value in it. So in subverting the quixotic mode, Austen is in many ways making a claim for the novel itself as being worthwhile. They don't just lead people astray, they have value. So that's another strand that we'll see running through the novel, and it's often enough a very overt one, a defence of novel reading itself against the reactionary views of this patriarchy who controlled literature and controlled what was considered worthwhile, and their idea of its lacking value. The irony was missed by early reviewers. Nowadays we can look at it and see it as one of the foremost strengths of this book, its weird, ironic posture. But early on this was not noticed. It was completely missed, as very clever things tend to be in the eras in which they're written. It was perceived as a sort of straightforward domestic Gothic, or at best as a quixotic novel in the style of the female Quixote, i.e. completely unoriginal. The irony itself was missed, was looked over. So before we go into looking at the extracts of texts I've chosen, we'll just foreground the themes we've been talking about. So there's the idea of the quixotic, the idea of living in a Gothic novel, how this contrasts with living in a real world. The value of reading, the value of novels, that they're not a waste of time, storytelling and narration itself, the idea of narrating a novel, the narrator's interactions with the characters, this kind of thing. Also time. We're not going to talk about this very much, but I'm flagging it up here as this is definitely something which appears, something which has a sort of symbolic resonance in the novels. When Catherine does go to Northanger Abbey, she is in this world of obsessive timekeeping, represented by the general, who gets upset if people don't come down to dinner at specific clock times. And it reflects something that was going on in the 18th into 19th centuries, of the time being normalised into something that has a sort of central control. The general represents the central control of time, which conflicts with the individual time of, for example, novel reading, of sitting and absorbing yourself into the world of a book. That is completely separate. It's a completely separate time space. So that's another, as I say, we're not going to talk about that a great deal, but that's another thread that's running through this novel. This is another theme and another symbol. So I found here a nice summary of this kind of double movement that we're looking at in this book. That on the surface level we have the sort of quixotic plot running through it, where Catherine is a fool who makes mistakes and ultimately ends up being cured of her delusions, which is then subverted by a lower level. The irony on the surface hints at this lower level, which is that Catherine was ultimately right all along, that she's vindicated. I'll just read this quote I've got here, because I think it summarises this nicely. One of the functions of the narrator's parodic/satiric voice is to sneer at the very fictional conventions which Northanger Abbey will later employ. For example, the narrator remarks that Mrs. Allen will not, like the typical chaperone of the sentimental or Gothic novel, whose conduct causes the heroine distress or terror, ruin Catherine's character or turn her out of doors. But John Thorpe does damage Catherine's reputation by his lies, while General Tilney does turn her out of doors. The narrator jokes that Frederick Tilney will not be the instigator of the horseman who will force Catherine into a carriage. Abduction of this kind was a common plot device in the sentimental novel, and the Gothic novel indeed. But John Thorpe does something very similar. So all of these things which Catherine is immediately mocked for as false assumptions, they do sort of end up happening, perhaps in a more benign form, but she is ultimately right in anticipating these things. The narrator, this is the irony, the narrator encourages the reader to expect that this novel will not employ the fictional conventions she mocks. Later, this defictionalization is partly reversed, as the reader comes to see that Northanger Abbey, in fact, uses its own version of the very fictional conventions the narrator has held up to ridicule. So the irony is all serving this function throughout the book. It's subverting itself, it's mocking, ostensibly seems to be mocking, but then at the end it turns out to be doing something quite different. It's for that reason a novel that very much rewards rereading. There's plenty of foreshadowing stuff going on in this book, so rereading it will really bring out that side of it. So now we're going to have a look at some extracts from the text. As I said, this makes up the lion's share of the class, as this represents what we would be doing in the class itself as a sort of group exercise or as a communal exercise. So I'll read a series of extracts and then just talk about them a bit. But I'll be following the sort of process that we've talked about up until this point. The surface level of Gothic parody, or the quixotic, that's at one level. How Catherine is corrected from this, which is where the female Quixote ends, with her being cured, and then how that's subverted with the idea that she might well have been right all along. And then I'll talk a bit about some what I've called metafictional elements of the text, points at which Austen is thinking about novel writing itself, making a defence of novel writing. Even at some points, what we might think of as perhaps writing a manifesto, making a claim for the value of novel writing in the modern world, and taking aim at people who oppose her or excoriating her enemies. So this is the beginning of the novel. I'll read this. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her father was a clergyman, without being neglected or poor, and a very respectable man, though his name was Richard. The joke here is just that it's a boring name. He's not called Montilione or something like a Gothic hero. And he had never been handsome. Again, handsome like a Gothic hero. He had a considerable independence besides 2 good livings, and he was not in the least addicted to locking up his daughters. Her mother was a woman of useful, plain sense, with a good temper, and what is more remarkable, with a good constitution. She had 3 sons before Catherine was born, and instead of dying and bringing the latter into the world, as anybody might expect, she still lived on, lived to have 6 children more, to see them growing up around her, and to enjoy excellent health herself. So these are all references to Gothic novel cliches, the mother dying early. We still see that in fairy tales often, like Cinderella, where you have the father living on and the sympathetic mother dying early, leaving the child as a sort of neglected semi-orphan. The reference there to locking up his daughters, also an obvious Gothic cliche. A family of 10 children will always be called a fine family, where there are heads and arms and legs enough for the number, but the Morlands had little other right to the word. They were in general very plain, and Catherine for many years of her life as plain as any. She had a thin, awkward figure, a sallow skin without colour, dark, lank hair, and strong features. So much for her person, and not less unpropitious for heroism seemed her mind. So the irony here, the author is talking about how she doesn't seem prone to heroism, i.e. she's normal. The word plain is used repeatedly there, and it's a very operative word. Plain means normal, i.e. not heroic, not exceptional. The plainness of her appearance is matched by the plainness of her character, her unremarkableness. The word plain tends to be, you might remember Jane Eyre, of course, in the 19th century. It's something which seems to have a subversive appeal for novelists, to make heroic the plain, if you like, which seems to be going on to some extent here. So the larger thrust of that extract is about, even from the beginning of the novel, to establish the Gothic cliches and to establish the ironic tone. I mean, this is rich with irony, isn't it? Jane Austen is writing with the most ironic tone, even from the beginning. I'll just read the next part. Mrs. Morland was a very good woman, and wished to see her children everything they ought to be, but her time was so much occupied in lying in and teaching the little ones that her elder daughters were inevitably left to shift for themselves. And it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books, or at least books of information. That word's used ironically, information, as if the Gothic novels are providing information. For provided that nothing like useful knowledge could be gained from them, provided they were all story and no reflection, she had never any objection to books at all. But from 15 to 17 she was in training for a heroine. She read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations, which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives. So the tone of the narrator is earnest here. It's very much acting as if what it's saying is true, that to be a heroine you need to read Gothic novels, that's the true version of the world. It's setting up this level of truth, of earnestness, so that it can subvert it with the irony that follows. And I mean, is even redolent here. So we see in this extract the process of the character of of Catherine moving from a sort of masculine physicality, or perhaps the general physicality of children where they're running around getting into scrapes, into a sort of training for a heroine, as the author says. which might represent a moving from the physical world into the feminized world, the world of the novel, the world of the interior, not just the sitting interior, as in sitting in a house and reading, but also the world of interiority, i.e. going inside your own head through the process of reading and the process of imagination. This seems to be what the author is saying is the process of becoming a hero or becoming a heroine. She had reached the age of 17 without having seen one amiable youth who could call forth her sensibility, without having inspired one real passion, and without having excited even any admiration but what was very moderate and very transient. So Austen here is mimicking that rhapsodic diction of Gothic and sentimental novels. Men are amiable youths who inspire love and devotion and mystery. Sensibility is a very loaded term. Sense and Sensibility, of course, another Austen novel. And it denotes a susceptibility to strong feelings and one's own sensitive nature, much in vogue in the 18th century. So there's a subtle little parody there, a little dig perhaps, at sensitivity, sensibility, the sentimental novel, because she's been reading so many of those, presumably. Mr. Allen, who owned the chief of the property about Fullerton, the village in Wiltshire, where the Morlands lived, was ordered to Bath for the benefit of a gouty constitution. Much like her father being named Richard, the idea that Bath is a place for adventure here is itself funny because it's such a mundane thing, a sort of boring spa town in the south of England. What possible adventures could happen there? And his lady, a good-humoured woman, fond of Miss Morland and probably aware that if adventures will not befall a young lady in her own village, she must seek them abroad, invited her to go with them. Mrs. Allen, I should say, is undoubtedly not aware of any of that at all. The ironic tone of the narrator is imputing what is obviously false. Invited her to go with them. Mr. and Mrs. Morland were all compliance, and Catherine all happiness. So we see here a nice instance of the narrator's own view and Catherine's view essentially being amalgamated. When I was talking about free and direct discourse, we perhaps have a good example of it here. The narrator, the third-person omniscient authority telling us this story, speaks as if Catherine's beliefs are their own. Probably aware the irony is there, but the voice is speaking earnestly. It's speaking as if these were Catherine's thoughts. It's channeling her own thoughts. There's no separation of them. There's a sort of ambiguity about where one begins and where one ends. So we'll skip forward slightly now. So this is when Catherine is bonding with Isabella over Gothic novels. We see this wonderful word, this wonderful charged word of horrid. But are they all horrid? Are you sure they're all horrid? Speaking of the novels that she's going to be introduced to by her compatriot, horrid is, of course, it's used here as a sort of affectation. It's a very loaded affect of Gothic fiction. Austen's making fun of its overuse. How horrid, being kind of every other sentence in these sorts of novels, horrid things around every horrid corner, and mocking it. So the desire for the horrid here is like the desire for titillation, perhaps. We can see a sort of parallel between the love of the feeling of horror here and the fact that people watch horror movies now. People go on roller coasters. People want to be scared. We see an example of that here. The sort of consumer culture of horror. Catherine listened with astonishment. She knew not how to reconcile two such very different accounts of the same thing. So this is her response to being repeatedly lied to by John Thorpe, or the fact that he'll say something and then counteract it in the very next sentence. She can't compute what he's doing because she's had such an innocent upbringing. She's never heard somebody lie before in her life, presumably. For she had not been brought up to understand the propensities of a rattle, nor to know how many idle assertions and impudent falsehoods the excess of vanity will lead. Her own family were plain, there's that word again, matter-of-fact people, who seldom aimed at wit of any kind. So a little joke at their expense there. Wit can mean several things. It might mean they're stupid, or it might simply mean that they're plain-speaking, earnest, honest. Her father, at the utmost, being contented with a pun, and her mother with a proverb, they were not in the habit, therefore, of telling lies to increase their importance, or of asserting at one moment what they would contradict the next. So we see here her innocence, her unworldliness, her naivety, conflicting with reality, her sort of learning how the world really is. And the novel uses this as a source of humour. Later on we see another good example of this with the general at Northanger Abbey showing Catherine around and making all sorts of boasts about his Staffordshire china, his hothouse with the pineapples, this kind of thing. And Catherine doesn't realise he's boasting because she can't read through the lines because she's naive, she's innocent. So as I said, this is a source of a lot of the tension in the text. Here we have the adventure to Blaise Castle. This is around about the time of the abduction scene, the very gothic, parodic abduction scene where John Thorpe rides away with Catherine. She's lured back on side. She's seduced back into being favourable to this coterie by being allured by the prospect of Blaise Castle, which they have quite cleverly predicted will appeal to her desire of the Gothic, her Gothic aspirational sensibilities. Blaise Castle, cried Catherine. What is that? The finest place in England, worth going 50 miles at any time to see. What? Is it really a castle? An old castle? The oldest in the kingdom. But is it like what one reads of? Exactly, the very same. But now really, are there towers and long galleries? By dozens. Then I should like to see it, but I cannot go. She clearly very much wants to go. The joke here, which perhaps a lot of people at the time would know, is that Blaise Castle is very far from being the oldest in the kingdom. It is in fact what's called a folly, a sham castle, which was built only a few years before the novel was written to give an impression of looking old. So it's like those sort of fake mansions with the pillars that you see in very vulgar new build houses in America or in London or wherever. It's a sort of 18th century equivalent of that. It's fake old. It's built in the spirit of the kind of Gothic boom of the time. I should like to see the castle, but may we go all over it? May we go up every staircase and into every suite of rooms? Yes, every hole and corner. So it's appealing to her desire of the horrid here, as it did earlier with the books. The delight of exploring an edifice like Udolpho, so that's The Mysteries of Udolpho, the novelist Miss Radcliffe's book, as her fancy represented Blaise Castle to be, so the novel, or the fictional, overprinting the real here, as we see repeatedly in this book, was such a counterpoise of good as might console her for almost anything. So absolutely, she can forgive anything, almost anything, as long as she gets to see the castle, such as her desire to live in this Gothic world. Blaise Castle remained her only comfort. Towards that she still looked at intervals with pleasure, though rather than be disappointed of the promised walk, and especially rather than be thought ill of by the Tilneys, she would willingly have given up all the happiness which its walls could supply, the happiness of a progress through a long suite of lofty rooms, exhibiting the remains of magnificent furniture, though now for many years deserted, the happiness of being stopped in their way along narrow winding vaults by a low grated door, or even of having their lamp, their only lamp, extinguished by a sudden gust of wind, and of being left in total darkness. So she's reaching very much into her fictional world now. We'll skip forward a bit now. So that was page 63. Now we'll go to page 102. So this now is a comparable event where she's going to see a castle, she's going to see an abbey. She's been invited to Northanger Abbey here. Her nascent romance with Henry is ongoing, so she's going to Northanger Abbey to stay there for a while. So we can contrast this with her earlier thoughts about Blaise Castle. Remember, she said she'd tolerate absolutely almost anything to see Blaise Castle. And in this romance with Henry, it seems as if Henry plays a small part in the appeal of the overall package. I'll read the extract. She was to be their chosen visitor. She was to be for weeks under the same roof with the person whose society she mostly prized. Mostly. And in addition to all the rest, this roof was to be the roof of an abbey. Her passion for ancient edifices was next in degree to her passion for Henry Tilney, and castles and abbeys made usually the charm of those reveries which his image did not fill. To see and explore either the ramparts and keep of the one, or the cloisters of the other, had been for many weeks a darling wish, though to be more than the visitor of an hour had seemed too nearly impossible to desire. And yet this was to happen. With all the chances against her of house, hall, place, park, court, and cottage, Northanger turned up an abbey, and she was to be its inhabitant. Its long damp passages, its narrow cells and ruined chapel were to be within her daily reach, and she could not entirely subdue the hope of some traditional legends, some awful memorials of an injured and ill-fated nun. What more could a girl want? So at the end there we have another Gothic cliché. This is the ill-fated nun. Several Gothic novels have this particular trope, but I think specifically the reference here is to Radcliffe's The Italian. So, as she says, we're seeing here her darling wish, the thing she wants more than anything and has done for many weeks. There's a nice little bit of irony there with the many weeks. The author is saying it as if that was a vast amount of time. You might think had been for her lifetime a darling wish, had been for many years a darling wish, but no, it's earnestly said for many weeks a darling wish. It's a subtle joke. The superiority of abode was no more to them than their superiority of person. Many were the inquiries she was eager to make of Miss Tilney, but so active were her thoughts that when these inquiries were answered, she was hardly more assured than before of Northanger Abbey having been a richly endowed convent at the time of the Reformation, of its having fallen into the hands of an ancestor of the Tilneys on its dissolution, of a large portion of the ancient building still making a part of the present dwelling, although the rest was decayed, or of it standing low in a valley sheltered from the north and east by rising woods of oak. Once again we see Catherine's imagination overwhelming reality, the straightforward quixotic occurring here. The mention there of the Reformation in the background, giving it a sort of historical charge. This leads to one of the more interesting and perhaps more famous sections of the book. This is when Henry is they're riding on the carriage towards Northanger Abbey, and Henry is gently teasing Catherine by describing the Gothic potentiality of Northanger Abbey, and she's very much on board with it, very much titillated and engaged. Henry is perhaps cleverly playing, much as John Thorpe and Isabella did earlier. He's playing with what he sees to be her single passionate interest for his own advantage, but in a more benign way. Well, perhaps in a way that doesn't turn out to be completely benign, as it lays the seeds of all of her later fears, but it's clearly meant with a degree of levity. It's clearly meant in a spirit of fun and a spirit of kind of light chastisement, light mockery that Henry is very much characterised with in this book. He's certainly a harmless, if faintly smug, figure, and I think ultimately quite a sympathetic character. So I'll just read this. He smiled and said, "You have formed a very favourable idea of the Abbey." "To be sure I have. Is not it a fine old place, just like one reads about? And are you prepared to encounter all the horrors that a building such as what one reads about may produce? Have you a stout heart, nerves fit for sliding panels and tapestry?" So, as I read the next part, just look for signs of foreshadowing here about the fearful encounters Catherine has later on when she gets to the Abbey. "How fearfully will you examine the furniture of your apartment, and what will you discern? Not tables, toilettes, wardrobes, or drawers, but on one side perhaps the remains of a broken lute, on the other a ponderous chest which no efforts can open. Oh, Mr. Tilney, how frightful! This is just like a book. But it cannot really happen to me. I am sure your housekeeper is not really Dorothy. Well, what then? Nothing further to alarm perhaps may occur the first night, but surmounting your unconquerable horror of the bed, you will retire to rest and get a few hours' unquiet slumber. But on the second, or at furthest, the third night after your arrival, you'll probably have a violent storm. Peals of thunder, so loud as to seem to shake the edifice to its foundation, will roll around the neighbouring mountains. In repassing through the small vaulted room, however, your eyes will be attracted towards a large, old-fashioned cabinet of ebony and gold, which, though narrowly examining the furniture before, you had passed unnoticed. Impelled by an irresistible presentiment, you will eagerly advance towards it, unlock its folding doors, and search into every drawer, but for some time without discovering anything of importance, perhaps nothing but a considerable hoard of diamonds. At last, however, by touching a secret spring, an inner compartment will open. A roll of paper appears. You seize it. It contains many sheets of manuscript. You hasten with the precious treasure into your own chamber. Oh, no, no, do not say so. Well, go on. So, as I said, quite a bit of foreshadowing there, particularly with the ponderous chest, which she encounters shortly after arrival, which no efforts can open. The joke there, of course, is that the efforts can't open it because she's not really trying. She's kind of too weak to open it properly. This is just like a book, she says, very much nailing on the head the quixotic or quixotic themes of the novel. Yes, this is just like a book. You are consciously converting your reality into a book, and Henry is here playing into that. So she's clearly excited, she's clearly amused, she's clearly titillated by what Henry's telling her. We have a bit more foreshadowing. We have a violent storm, which happens in the book, happens in the story. Yeah, and then we have the cabinet, the inner compartment. Here it is. Yeah, the cabinet with an inner compartment, which she opens with a roll of papers, which she seizes. Of course, when that happens, it's too dark for her to see that the papers are just harmless receipts. So she lies awake, having a sleepless night, filled with anticipation of what forbidden secrets these hidden Gothic documents really contain. Of course, that's completely deflated by the events later in the story. She has moments of realization. She kind of slightly deflates from these Gothic heights. She speaks about the rising shame of having harboured for some minutes an absurd expectation. Was then added the shame of being caught in so idle a search. This is the incident with the heavy chest, which contains nothing but extra sheets and fabrics. But despite that, every realization like this she has as to the silliness of her presentiments doesn't stop her going through exactly the same process again. Here we have the later event. She was struck by the appearance of a high, old-fashioned black cabinet, which, though in a situation conspicuous enough, had never caught her notice before. Henry's words, his description of the ebony cabinet, which was to escape her observation at first, immediately rushed across her, and though there could be nothing really in it, there was something whimsical. It was certainly a very remarkable coincidence. So there's something slightly ambiguous about this. She's aware that she is fulfilling the prophecy, such as it is, the anticipation of Henry's predictions, but we wonder what Henry's motivation is. Is this a very remarkable coincidence? Has she just sought out what she's so desirous of finding? Is she just fulfilling her own Gothic prophecy? Or has Henry to some extent done this deliberately? We wouldn't put it past him. He's kind of a joker figure. Has he deliberately described to her items which he knows she will encounter in order to put her in perhaps a bit of a pickle? He might not anticipate the extent to which she gets worked up, but perhaps he has a degree of control over the situation as it unfolds. Perhaps he's sort of laid the groundwork of the situation that she finds herself in, at least in this benign way. He doesn't say anything that implies the general murdering his wife, but this stuff that works her up to that level, this entry-level Gothic jokery, is perhaps instituted by Henry, which because of its role in leading her to that fatal conclusion, perhaps makes him to some extent culpable, perhaps makes her more innocent. It certainly doesn't seem like she deserves fully the chiding he gives her for jumping to that conclusion. So here we have her, the embryonic stage of her views as to the situation of General Tilney's wife, the Gothic mystery of what might have happened to her. Was she a very charming woman? Was she handsome? Was there any picture of her in the Abbey? And why had she been so partial to that grove? Was it from dejection of spirits? Were questions now eagerly poured forth? The first three received a steady affirmative. The two others were passed by, and Catherine's interest in the deceased Miss Tilney augmented with every question, whether answered or not. Of her unhappiness in marriage she felt persuaded. The general certainly had been an unkind husband. He did not love her walk. Could he therefore have loved her? And besides, handsome as he was, there was something in his turn of features which spoke of his not having behaved well to her. Here was another proof, a portrait, very like of a departed wife, not valued by the husband. He must have been dreadfully cruel to her. Catherine attempted no longer to hide from herself the nature of the feelings which, in spite of all his attentions, he had previously excited. And what had been terror and dislike before was now absolute aversion. Yes, aversion. His cruelty to such a charming woman made him odious to her. She had often read of such characters which Mr. Allen had been used to call unnatural and overdrawn, but here was proof positive to the contrary. So this is where she sees her own vindication. Now at last she thinks, I was right all along. She's creating this all in her own mind. As I said, she does turn out to be right, but this isn't the reason why. She's convinced herself that the General is a real-world manifestation of a Gothic cliché, of a Gothic trope. And he isn't. He's not murdered his wife. He doesn't have secret panels and things like this. But she's essentially correct in her intuition. The General certainly had been an unkind husband, she says. Where's that? Wait, have I gone back a page? Oh, here we are. Yeah, the General certainly had been an unkind husband. Well, we learn later that she's completely correct in this intuition. She says there's something in the turn of his features which spoke of his not behaving well to her. Again, she's right, completely right. The General was horrible to his wife, and indeed he turns out to just generally be a horrible person. Dreadfully cruel, another completely accurate description. She's right to have an aversion to him, despite him ostensibly being charming to her and making a real effort to charm her, because he thinks she's wealthy and wants to win her into the family to get her money. She's right to feel aversion. So in effect she's demonstrating a correctness here. She's anticipating what will really happen when he finds out that she's poor. So what we see is that she does reach some quite absurd conclusions, but she's correct in that starting point. She only uses the topography and the language of Gothic fiction, which she's familiar with, because that's all she's read. She's using that language to justify her completely accurate instincts. So expressing correct ideas as a starting point, but eventually getting twisted up because she goes too far into the cliché of the Gothic. But ultimately she is, in these descriptions, quite right, as we'll see. So this is her carrying on her thought process on this topic. No, said Miss Tilney, sighing. I was unfortunately from home. Her illness, this is the mother, was sudden and short, and before I arrived it was all over. So she died. Catherine's blood ran cold with the horrid suggestions, there's that word horrid now, bleeding over from descriptions of Gothic novels into reality, which naturally sprang from these words. Could it be possible? Could Henry's father, just left hanging there with an ellipsis? And yet, how many were the examples to justify even the blackest suspicions? And when she saw him in the evening while she worked with her friend, slowly pacing the drawing room for an hour together in silent thoughtfulness, with downcast eyes and contracted brow, she felt secure from all possibility of wronging him. It was the air and attitude of a Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to every sense of humanity, in its fearful review of past scenes of guilt? Unhappy man! And the anxiousness of her spirits directed her eyes towards his figure so repeatedly as to catch Miss Tilney's notice. My father, she whispered, often walks about the room in this way. It is nothing unusual. So the Montoni here is a reference to the villain of the Mysteries of Udolpho. Catherine is from her correct starting point, now going completely into the Gothic cliché, sort of confirming her own suspicions and working herself up through this process of arbitrary self-justification. So in the next section we'll see how she has that Arabella moment of being corrected and confronted by reality. I'm just going to have a pause here to make sure the video is recording properly, so I don't have to record everything again if it's not.